Greetings, everybody, and welcome to This is Revolution. My name is Jean Badgelan, in today for Jason Miles, who is taking a well-earned break. But before we begin today's show, let me just remind you all to like and subscribe, hit the bell, and of course, if you have the means, please consider supporting This is Revolution on Patreon. Your support is what helps us make this show, keeps everything running, and we really appreciate it. And of course, if you also want to do something else to help out the show, you can drop a super chat. And if you drop a super chat, your super chat will be read by the one, the only super producer, M. Tucson. For all you boppers out there, hello, M. Tucson, the voice of New York City. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing...
Ponytail of reason.
Ponytail of reason. Well, no, I think you're the voice of New York City. You're the most New York person I've ever heard. It's very nice to hear a New York accent in real life.
That's crazy.
Is it crazy?
We're everywhere.
Well, you're not everywhere I am. I'll tell you that. Okay. You're not in Springfield.
That's
but
right.
Don't worry, everybody out there. It's not just TRI B-listers today. We have, of course, with us the one, the only, Mr. Pascal Robert. Pascal, how are you doing today?
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jeans Badgelan and M. Toussaint. Doing wonderful, doing well. Glad to hear. I hope Jason's having some good time off.
I think he deserves the break. He's been working hard.
Mm-hmm.
No doubt.
And of course, it's Saturday. So who else is going to be here? But of course, Marcus from the Left Flank Blitz. How you doing, Marcus?
Yo, what's up? Doing well. Happy to be here. Excited to talk about some movies and TV shows today. It's going to be a good one.
Easy preparation for the day, right? Not so much reading, more sitting down, putting on Netflix, having fun, because that's the topic for the day. We're going to be talking about, class in cinema. There's definitely been an uptick in apparently socially class conscious movies. I guess, I don't know, Pascal, anti-capitalism is hot and sexy today on the TV, on the
So they say.
Well, whatever floats people's boats. Oh, look, we already have a super chat.
Have a super chat from.
Oh, and it's in what is a CAD? What is that? Canadian money?
Canadian. Mm-hmm.
You'd be
told it's real.
So what does this super chat say?
You'd be surprised how many people love the crack.
Oh yeah, that's true. This is the problem when Jason's not here. We don't have a soundboard, right? Like TIR is very much a soundboard. Do you feel naked without the soundboard, Pascal? Without the applause when you come on?
Without the applause, it definitely doesn't have the same effect. But we can cover for it with the quality of content. We've done it before.
We will. We will survive without our fearless leader. So let me bring on today's guest so we can get crack-a-lacking, as we say in the Badgelan household. So today's guest is Daniel Tutt, a lecturer, a scholar, and an author of a book called Psychoanalysis and the Politics of the Family. And he is also the host of the Jouissance Vampires podcast. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It is some kind of French word. So Pascal probably would be able to pronounce it if I had given it to him. Jouissance. Is that correct, Pascal? I'm going to put it in the internal chat so that you can inform us of the correct pronunciation. Jouissance. Yeah. Formidable. Formidable. Ça c'est bon parce que je parle français. Okay, so maintenant nous avons guest très important. Monsieur Professor Dr. Daniel Tutt. Hello, Daniel. Welcome.
Daniel, I blame you completely for having Jean be relegated to having to speak French on the show.
Yeah, that podcast has been a blast. Jouissance is just enjoyment. You know that, right? It's just enjoyment. It's like the politics of enjoyment in English, you know, like this is like Zizek's entire project. It's not only his, it's like what psychoanalysis has to say about critique of political economy, or like where it enters into the fray. That like we got to think about pleasure and desire and enjoyment and subjectivity and sex, that kind of stuff. So
What movies are we going to be talking about today?
yeah, well, yeah, that's a good point. The movies I wanted us to chat about don't talk about sex. Or, I mean, yeah, no, it's always there.
Yeah.
But yeah, everything is sex at the end of the day, I suppose.
Well, Daniel, one of the things that I wanted to say before we get too deep into the weeds with your various thoughts and ideas about pop culture, TV, and film is that I'm very glad to have you on for one of the reasons is that the main reason that one of the things that we do on our show, and I think we do relatively well, is pop culture critique within the framing of capitalist realisms and its utility of popular culture as a vehicle of social engineering and social control. I myself am a bit of a Frankfurt School kind of individual in terms of one-dimensional man, Marcuse, in terms of my belief that capitalism and media within the framing of capitalism serves ultimately a nefarious goal to program individuals, number one, not only as consumers, but as a kind of one-dimensional type drones within the kind of consumeristic paradigm. Mm-hmm. That being said, because you're so interested in the way in which class has been illustrated through television and media through time, not limited to the examples that you give in your introduction, but I'd like you to give some commentary into how particularly not so much film, but television intercedes and enters into the Fordist post-World War II period to become a vehicle of entertainment for Americans, and what that says about its utility per se. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Television in particular?
Yes.
Yeah. It's a good question. Yeah, I'm thinking here of like Adorno and Horkheimer's The Culture Industry. I think there's a sense in which you could say that the rise of mass entertainment through kind of a consumptive Hollywood-centered model has depoliticized class. One could make the argument that when Parasite, an explicitly class-conscious film, was given Best Picture a few years ago, it was ironic because we all know Hollywood can't think class. Yeah. So if Hollywood portrays class, you kind of need psychoanalysis to understand it because it's sort of Hollywood's unconscious in some sense. I don't think, therefore, that we should be vulgar and say, well, only the directors, and probably we can count them on one hand, who have explicit class-conscious goals like Boots Riley or the guy that did Parasite, as well as Snowpiercer, which Snowpiercer is even more of a Marxist portrayal, I would argue. I'm going to mess up his name. Bong Joon-ho. Is that right? Okay. So even though all the stuff we want to talk about, like post-2008 film, television, etc., and Pascal is inviting us to go back further. Let's do that. Even though I haven't thought about that, that's cool. Let's bring it up. My argument would be that class still thinks, and it thinks no matter what. It's like a kind of driving antagonism that's going to look different based on certain intervals of social, like real social conflict. So my argument is that there's a new genre that's emerged since 2008, which was spearheaded by Hunger Games. And this is a kind of both futuristic dystopian as well as realist contemporary dystopian. And we can kind of make an inventory of films that fall under this. And my argument is that part of the imagination of these films, the kind of underbelly, is actually to portray social relations more along a kind of neo-feudal basis than we would think a normal, a kind of ordinary Marxist view of class. There's some exceptions to that, not many. I personally think that the Marxist view of class is more interesting because it's more transformative, it's more potentially revolutionary. I think if you portray the social reality of capitalism in a quasi-feudal way, what you basically do is you foreclose any class action, any
Right.
possibility of change in some sense, right? So therefore, the shows are going to be violent, representing a profound stagnation. I was using the example of Ozark or Breaking Bad. In both instances, the backdrop to me is more neo-feudal of society, precisely because even though the characters make millions of dollars, they do it through legal yet illicitly illegal means, and their originary class position, whether that be as a hillbilly or as a high school teacher in the case of Breaking Bad, they don't actually have any social mobility. Nobody changes their class position. To me, that's more neo-feudal. And that's a dark reflection on the reality of post-2008 sentiment, right? That actually, that whole kind of Horatio Alger bootstrap ideology is dead. Anyone that speaks of it knows that it's dead. So you're kind of speaking ideologically if you say it, right? So how is that death portrayed in film? Is my question that I want.
Excellent. That's a really great point. Now, let's get some basic terms off and running here. Can you define for us, when you use class, what do you mean by class exactly?
Yeah. All right. So this is obviously a big debate that we've been having, and it's a great, healthy debate. From a Marxist standpoint, there's a sense in which class antagonism is largely around two primary classes, proletariat and bourgeoisie, and that there is therefore an affirmation that there is a ruling class, which controls also the means of the state apparatus, as well as property and the surplus distribution. So that is a fundamental point from a Marxist standpoint. And if you therefore accept that necessity, you then also have to recognize that antagonism is privileged through the primacy of class relations. However, within more recent Marxism, we can point to different schools of thought, such as what they call anti-essentialist Marxism or postmodern Marxism, which for some people, it makes their hair stand on edge when they hear postmodern Marxism, because they think it's academic and they think it's relativist and so on. But in those camps, they kind of say class actually is a little bit more voluntarist, and that class is a kind of discursive production, in a sense. Like we build class consciousness by kind of moving like a chess game around. Whereas there's another vision of class that's, if it's more primary, you have already a working class by virtue of the division of labor. You don't need to go kind of like discursively invent it in struggle per se. It's already there. You need to just work with it as a feature. Okay, so I've given you two ways to think about class from a Marxist point of view. More and more, my friends, I follow the kind of first orientation that there is a kind of necessary basis of class. Therefore, class is not a mental act. It's not a voluntary mental act. Now, I think that this vision of class is obviously quite hard for us to think. And I would say actually it is almost a little traumatic for us to sort of think about the world structured in that way, in that sense. So I would sort of frame it like that and say that class remains, from a Marxist point of view, the necessity of antagonism, from which we then can examine a lot of the debates about how ethnic identity, race, etc., mold off of that. But if we accept the view of the primacy of class, I think there's certain consequences and debates that we have to have after we've done that. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. Well, what I want to kind of just roll up on that is, obviously you have kind of two different paradigms of looking at class. So obviously, from the Marxist, from a certain reading of the Marxist understanding of class, we're talking about like something that can be more or less objectively defined within the relations of production, who controls what, who controls the means of production, and of course even within the works of Marx, there is he could use proletariat in one way, which is quite, and then working class and working men in a slightly different way to encompass groups that don't quite fit into the paradigm. And then, of course, there's the other question of, a class in itself and a class for itself, and the question of consciousness, which is a thread, goes back, into Marx, I guess, into Lukács as well, and other thinkers. And then there's a third kind of understanding of class, which is almost which is a conservative understanding, at least comes out of people like Burnham, and then attempts to reconcile the whole PMC debate, reconcile conservative cultural notions of class, which are not quite ethnic, but they're not quite they're not quite objective, but in the sense, when, for example, conservatives talk about working class, they're not necessarily talking about peoples whose relations to the means of production are a certain way, but rather peoples whose cultural identity is more or less unified. For example, people in the Midwest who work with their hands. You may be a small business owner, or you may be someone who works in a factory, but you're unified in this concept of class. So it's a kind of culturalized notion of class. And I think when we see these attempts of left and right to discuss class, I think often leftists are being deluded into believing that the right wingers, when they say class, they mean the same thing that they mean, when often they don't. And I think these different notions of class in American popular culture are kind of like bouncing against each other in a certain way. And I think Pascal raised it right at the beginning. Is like, we're talking about a post 2008 American pop culture and this portrayal of class. But there's always been portrayal of class in American pop culture, and a portrayal of like how, for example, a lot of black TV shows that we've discussed on the show before are attempting to present a kind of ideal type of what a member of a productive middle class should be, or like how what behavioral norms should be. But like, we're moving from a way in which mass television, in the way Pascal mentioned it, is trying to define an appropriate sort of how to be a civilized member of society and the mythical American middle class, to a paradigm where people are like trying to make money off being critical of the class divisions in society. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I know, like, I guess going from class onto like more of the discussion in like TV and film, and you kind of just saying that like the portrayal of class is changing, at this time period now.
Yeah.
Can you kind of like at least go back, and describe maybe like, hey, this is what was happening beforehand as far as the class narratives, and then as to where like you see the, when does this change into this time period now?
Yeah, I think there's a great article by this scholar Will Davies where he says, what we call the neoliberal social order, which emerges, like in the late 70s as we transition to a society in which the relationship between labor and capital changes, and labor loses its hegemony, its power in that negotiation process with the capitalist class. That is what they call like the era when money is making money off of money. Money is not necessarily making money off of productive labor in the same way. So therefore you have a precarious working class emerge. fragmented working class emerge, and we're all familiar with that. Now, from the standpoint of discipline and control over the social power over society, Will Davies says that actually from about the early 80s up to early 2000s, he calls it the period of normal neoliberalism, in which kind of all of the ideological basis of how we believe in the middle class ideal, that kind of standard way of thinking about class, and even about thinking about the working class, was kind of stable in a certain sense. And then he says that 2008 and even a little before it propelled the social order into what he calls a disciplinary social order. Disciplinary. So now that narrative breaks down, and we have to face the real of what we didn't want to face, right? The curtain kind of falls down. And I think in that way, I would argue that Hollywood, film, television, etc., portrays the class dynamic, or has to portray the class dynamic, with that new emphasis on discipline. That's portrayed a little differently. That's where what Yanis Varoufakis and Jody Dean called the neo-feudal idea comes into play. And I know that's a big debate, which I myself am not like decided on whether I agree or disagree with the neo-feudal thesis, but I think that its proposals are quite worth considering at the minimum. So that would be my argument, Marcus, which is we're in a fundamentally, and so what is the disciplinary? It's an extractive economy based on our consumer goods. So the rise of the gig economy is one great example of this. They're like literally our consumer goods, from cars to our phones to our applications, are the means for big monopoly corporations to extract profits from, right? That means that the site of extraction is coming through service labor, not as much through productive labor, right? That changes actually the basis of the traditional Marxist view from the side of production, right? Changes that to the side of service. Another aspect here is that power is no longer centralized vis-a-vis state power in the same way that it was. It's what they call parcellated sovereignty. So the way that's portrayed a lot on dystopian film and television is that criminality is legal, right? You have like basically emerge kind of mafioso crime syndicalist capitalism, which is true. It's a true reality evidenced by the tax havens, for example. And there's actually some studies which shows that part of the way that capitalism saved itself after 2008 was through these illegal criminal sources. Okay. So how is legal criminality portrayed? I think there's so many examples of films that fit into that structure. Breaking Bad is probably one of my favorite examples of that. The other thing of the argument, I don't know if you guys want to get into the neo-feudal thing, or does that answer your question, Marcus? I won't stop there.
Yeah, no, and that's where I think, and I think it's like kind of like going just into like, yeah, this is the, the current phase of how class is portrayed, and then I'm like, you know, like appreciating too of like saying like, in a ways it's like I don't know, it's a different way of like especially a show like Breaking Bad, because the whole time, you know, which I enjoy the show, but like the whole time, you know, I'm thinking in my head like, why did he just take the money from his rich friends? And but actually having, you know, a little bit of a deeper analysis of saying of like, what does the structure of this story say about the way, you know, stories are structured, and why, you know, what can and can't be sold to the American, or not just the American public, but the public in general.
Right.
And also, I guess, yeah. So I guess, yeah, I mean, the next question is like, what does that say, you know, about the society we're existing in now? I guess, you know, like, how do you see this change kind of affecting, you know, people or the consumer of this entertainment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I feel like part of the genre was opened by the Hunger Games, which was a wildly successful trilogy, originally as young adult literature, came out around 2008. And you all know the basic premise of the Hunger Games.
Yeah.
What I perceive as it commenting on is a weird inversion of capitalist competition. So if the neo-feudal thesis is kind of correct, which is that at the top of capitalism, you have these huge monopolies like Google, Facebook, and all the big Google tech platforms. That's the top. At the bottom, you have a fight to the death amongst the proles, right? And this is evidenced even by the mantra of Occupy Wall Street, right? 1% versus 99. So there's a kind of sense in which, in the neo-feudal thesis that Jody Dean develops, the thinker Jody Dean develops this idea mostly. So what she calls a new peasantry and lordship struggle emerges, right? And the cool thing about Hunger Games, to be charitable to it, even though it's portraying that in a dystopian way, it's actually a film about subverting that through creating a kind of radical class consciousness from below and having a violent insurrection on the feudal lords, so to speak, right? And that's actually pretty noteworthy about the film and subversive. And of course, the Katniss character uses her own suicide as a kind of so it's also something about the conditions of post-2008 discipline produce a lot of violence, right?
Right.
And that social protest, and I think this is true as well, takes the form of violence, and we have to honor that and recognize that, right? So, like, if the capital labor relation has changed fundamentally, another big theme that a lot of Marxist theorists develop is what they call surplus rebellions, which is, if the working class is a kind of fragmented agency, part of what that means is that a lot of uprising, a lot of social unrest, therefore a lot of possible social transformation, is actually going to be coming from classes that are basically surplus classes on the margins of working class, below working class, lumpen proletariat, if you like. And that's actually another theme that I wanted to chat with y'all about, which is the theme of hinterland, which is that the disciplinary era of neoliberalism has produced a hinterlandization of poverty, right? Where, like, class now is geographical as well, and it lives on the margins. It's a global phenomenon, not just American. You can find it in this kind of geography of scattered along the periphery of urban areas. And I felt like Nomadland, which is a movie that I personally found quite challenging and good, is a good example of a portrayal of this kind of new sort of sub-working class, unhoused, highly precarious social class, right? And I feel like that film was something I wanted to chat with you about, in part because it really, I feel like we know, all of us know people that have fallen into those conditions. But the ideology of American middle class liberalism doesn't allow us to see them as classed. So if you talk to boomers about that film, they're not going to say, "Oh, that lady in there was working the sub-working class," because that's not a language that people have intuitively, right? We don't see people classed basis. I would argue.
Yeah, I mean, I think especially in America, there is often, strong cultural connotations or lifestyle choice connotations or subcultural identifications that people put on groups in order to avoid, talking about class when class is the most cogent methodology to talk about something. But I just wanted to step back and, talk a little bit about neo-feudalism and get everybody's thoughts on this. I mean, my perception of the neo-feudalist thesis is less that we're moving into a qualitatively new era of post-capitalism, but rather I think it speaks to the loss of innocence amongst regarding liberalism, as to the ability of liberal democracy or bourgeois democracy to address any of the major social problems created by capitalism. Like the main ideology of capitalism from the 30s right down to the end of the Cold War was this, notion of a regulated capitalism, where socialist politics was often diverted into reforming and saving capitalist politics from itself. But of course, in the post-Cold War era, it's becoming increasingly apparent that this kind of belief that major social change or even large reforms can be brought about through the traditional pathways of political action. That innocence has kind of disappeared. We've seen reports, for example, there was the Princeton report, which was like, oh, what people want and what people get from their government have no relationship. And this is the kind of curtain is being lifted up on what has always, to a certain extent, been a case. And the way people are responding to it is to argue that there is that we're entering a qualitatively new stage of capitalism, but when in fact we're not. We're in a stage where the belief in liberal democracy has declined, and the default ideology of capitalism now is anti-capitalism, like that the system sucks. There's nothing we can do about it except sit here and be cynical, and that breeds a kind of view of the world that we're neo-feudal, which I think the metaphor of feudalism is not a particularly strong one, because feudal societies were static, and they were not, they were cyclical societies, and they weren't growth orientated in the way that capitalism is. Capitalism is very different from feudalism, but from its inception, there have been families of rich people have been able to maintain their wealth across generations, and you do have people, you do have inherited wealth and things. That's always been the case. There has been periods of more or less social mobility, but I don't think we're returning to a new type of feudalism per se. I mean, Pascal, Marcus, M. Toussaint, what do you think?
I've never been one to really. I mean, I do think that we're in a period of crisis and precarity, in that there is a crisis of governance that's coming about as a product of liberal democracy being unable to deal with the interwoven conflicts and contradictions of capital. So that's one part. So there's a crisis and there's precarity in that, because there is increased scarcity, there is definitely a depreciating quality of life. Does that necessarily translate into us moving into feudalism? I think that there is an evolution into the type of capitalism we're in, or the type of neoliberalism we're in, particularly with the rise of the gig economy and the options of labor that we have. But that doesn't mean that the basic nature of extraction of wealth from employer and employee has completely been eviscerated from the nature of labor and management relations. So I'm not necessarily convinced that we're in some type of feudalism per se. I just believe that we're in an increasingly precarious situation that is more volatile than what we've seen in the last 50 years.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that, and especially, and I'm happy Daniel mentioned Yanis Varoufakis, and is he speaks a lot about the techno feudalism, in which case, yeah, these large tech companies, and I there's aspects to it, which I agree with, especially when you see what was it, Amazon is buying this major medical system and pharmaceutical apparatus in order to kind of probably build in that type of feudalistic structure. For me, I'm just not sure of yeah, or is it going back into a neo-feudalism? And like, and I also kind of like the relation of things going back to like company towns
Hmm.
and things of that nature, where is this some type of a new techno neo-feudalism, or is this just company towns but online? Um,
Yeah.
you know, and then we really at this point now we're just kind of like, oh, yeah, like having a very academic discussion about like what to call this thing and like the aspects of it. But I think
Yeah.
where like everyone agrees is like, yeah, like Pascal said, things are getting worse.
Yeah.
That is evident, and that's being shown through film and television and stuff like that. People tying into it, but how do we understand that? And I think like for us, we're having kind of like this conversation about like techno feudalism and all this type of
Right.
stuff. But you've got people like Tim Pool who they watched Parasite, and they're like, oh, or maybe it was the not Parasite, but Squid Game, and they're like, yeah, this is just talking about how bad communism is. So it's like,
Yeah.
same with that. And as you're describing it, it's like we as as a community, especially in the United States, have trouble with class and even understanding it in
Right.
terms. And so yeah, when you're making these films and it's attractive to people because it's giving them a sense of their own reality, but like they don't even know how to describe it. It's like
Hmm.
a cat chasing a mouse on the TV screen. Like there's a layer there that's just like it's not able to interpret.
Yeah. Part of me, I share Pascal's skepticism about the proposal of that we're in a neo-feudal arrangement, because capitalism, if you study its history, has kind of gone through these types of movements before, especially like late 19th century. Number one. Number two, what I will say I kind of like about it is that it invites us perhaps to face a more revolutionary question about how to truly break from capitalism. Because if the Marxist view of class is one that insists that the proletariat must reach a point where it has decided for the abolition of the class system. So like if class is not an identity and classes has a primacy and we want to abolish it, that what is the consequence of that? That means that we have to abolish capitalism as such. Jody Dean says the beauty or the strength of the neo-feudal thesis is found in the fact that it focuses attention to the political economy and not to this debate that the left has between democracy and fascism. So she thinks it's a good thesis for that reason, that it focuses on the economic crisis and forces us to kind of just focus on that as a site of struggle. And I'm not really convinced. I mean, I agree with that to an extent, but I think one challenge we get is a lot of people basically coming back and saying, yeah, let's go make capitalism better. So we get is a kind of anti-capitalist nostalgia for going back to the welfare state.
No, I mean, yeah, go ahead,
Right.
Antisom.
We do have we had a movement a little while ago for conscious capitalism. And
Yep.
it was a thing that I wanted to watch. Conscious capitalism, B Corps, benefit corporations. It's not really a company structure. It's like a certification you can get if your company passes all of these different tests to make sure you're not killing people, not like killing children, eating children, whatever, right? Making sure you're a good company. But the founders of conscious capitalism are now in the news for labor violations, and
Right.
they're all starting unions. That's Starbucks. What's the other one? Container Store is still in the clear, but there are others where it's like you guys were you wrote books about being the good guys. You wrote books about better capitalism. So
Right.
I guess
There's
that's
no
kind of
ethical consumption under capitalism.
there you go.
And that's where it's like there's always going to be limits to it, right?
Right.
Because at some level, it's like, yeah, they're good. You're going to have these CEOs in these boardrooms who are like, well, yeah, we built the new store we're giving you some college money. It's like, what more do you want? But it's not necessarily like those things don't, like the benefits that you get from your job don't exist in the vacuum. They
Right.
only matter as they relate to the outside conditions out, like what do they provide you outside of work?
Right.
And then like there's a big, the the big elephant in the room is, well, how much does your work actually provide to the business versus what you get in return for that work?
Or are
And
you ever outside of work?
oh,
Yeah.
well, that's where too, and I think that's where like maybe it was like the techno feudalism stuff. Like maybe that's where I definitely see it agreeing, where it's like people are just like living at work,
Yep.
and you get the nap pods and on site medical staff and
What is
all
it,
the food and
995?
kitchen and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, they've done studies that actually medieval serfs worked less than we do.
Yeah.
That's just a fact, right? So, uh,
It's pretty depressing. It's a
I
pretty
mean, yeah, it's and that's actually a big theme. I think that in film and television you see a lot, especially in a film like Sorry to Bother You,
yeah.
which is
Right.
telling the perspective of a working class person. Because keep in mind, I would argue that a middle class person, based on the kind of social capital that they've been imbued with through their networks and family, they enter the workforce with the demand to find some meaningful work. But you'll remember the protagonist in Sorry to Bother You. Why was he trying to find a job? Actually, had nothing to do with meaning. It was to get off of his uncle's couch. He was living in his uncle's garage. So that's a way of a class conscious portrayal, which is helpful, because typically, Pascal, I think Hollywood just portrays things from the middle class perspective, and
Right.
they take that as the norm. When in reality, working class people are usually just trying to find a job.
Mm-hmm.
If meaning comes from that, okay, great. I doubt it, but okay, meaning's going to come elsewhere, not from the job, and we accept that to some extent,
That
right?
explains a lot to me personally, because I feel like my experience as the precariat um, hasn't. I don't see it reflected. I don't see it reflected in anything, and it makes sense that you had mentioned Hollywood has to use this kind of mystification in dealing with class, and a lot of this is coming from a middle class point of view. That makes a
That's
lot of
actually a great point, because maybe one thing is that when Hollywood thinks class, they
Mhm.
only think it violent, catastrophic, nihilistically, like
Defensively.
I'm thinking of like Ozark, and I'm thinking of even an interesting one, Made, on Netflix,
Mm-hmm.
was a very interesting film. I would argue it's not like a revolutionary film at all, but it dealt with the shame of working the gig economy. You know, she's attractive, young, white woman working as a maid, and from the perspective of a boomer middle class looking at that character, they would say, "What did you do wrong? Why are you working as a maid? Why did you? It must be your fault."
Right.
They can't think of her as a classed person,
Mhm.
because she should have all these abilities and so on.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, I think that's an excellent point in the way that, as you said, Antuson, like with the kind of neo-feudal portrayal of class, of class and of capitalism, we're kind of making the thesis that there is another way, there is a reformable capitalism. Neo-feudalism, although this is obviously not Jodie Dean's intention, and I think her impulse to get the discussion away from the like complete pure liberal discussion of like even like the Democratic Party frame of it's fascism versus democracy. That is the fundamental axis of Democratic Party politics today. But by putting forward a concept like neo-feudalism, or as Pascal talks about quite a lot, racial capitalism, by talking about this, we're actually obfuscating that the issue is not a particular formulation of capitalism or this new iteration of something that is post-capitalism, but it is capitalism itself. I think by using this language of qualification to talk about the evolution of capitalist relations, we feed into the ideology of anti-capitalism that capitalism itself uses to sustain and reconstruct itself by hyphening off particular, to use an analogy, it's like talking about police reform and like having sensitivity training for polices. That frame, by saying that's the problem, that it's racism, by saying the problem with the police is racism, obfuscates the broader context within which bad policing and violent policing is taking place, which is the total economic barbarization of many of the inner cities. Racism plays a role. It's a historic thing. But if all those inner city neighborhoods of Black people were like quite wealthy and peaceful, like there would probably not be all the violence that takes place, because it's a reflection of the declining society. So I think like something like Sorry to Bother You, which even, at the end, even in that movie, there are moments where it shows capitalism trying to reincorporate anti-capitalism, because they're bringing him on all the TV shows. He's yelling and he's like, no, this is wrong. And they're like clapping like seals. And it's like, yay, anti-capitalism. But like nothing changed. They're just making a buck of it.
Yeah.
That is more, I think that's a stronger critique than the neo-feudal critique, which to a certain degree not only sets it up as a problem different from capitalism, but is also kind of disempowering, because feudal relations in themselves were kind of eternal relations.
Right.
We didn't have the social mobility of bourgeois society that framed us. Feudalism was your daddy was a farmer, you're a farmer, your son is the farmer, and things will go on and on in this way. Where I think Hunger Games deviates from it is that in a lot of movies, the result is, a lot of the neo-feudal style movies, is the result is the bad king is overthrown and the new, more just king comes to power. I think where Hunger Games flips from the script from your like average neo-feudal epic, and we can include fantasy in it stuff. We could include something like Dune, something like Game of Thrones, is that the problem is usually resolved with the bad king removed and the good king who is better to the people.
Yeah.
You basically have a conservative message where the king will save the masses from the aristocracy. The good king will save the masses from the aristocracy. Hunger Games doesn't do that. But that's why I think the neo-feudalist types of movies, that's why I think they are like ultimately reactionary portrayals of class in a way that something like definitely like Sorry to Bother You, which was made by a guy who identifies himself as a communist. That's where that critique is different. I wonder what everybody thinks.
I actually agree with Gene that the Hunger Games manifestation of the neo-feudal depiction is not a revolutionary depiction. I think it is reactionary. I think that Hunger Games is actually more saying, look, we could be like this. How bad does this really look? As opposed to, oh my God, this is terrible. In other words, there's a part of it, I think, that is almost kind of celebrating the carnivorous nature of the class schism in the societies that come about in that time. Yes, it's obviously terrible what they've reduced society to. But I there's something about Hunger Games I've always felt is not appealing to a revolutionary, subversive content within the populace, but is appealing to a kind of reactionary element.
I think.
I don't know what were you gonna say, Marcus?
I think what it is because a lot of these movies frame they put you in the future, but they frame it is in something happened, after the time that you're watching the film, but before the time the film is happening. Humanity made this big grave mistake. So as long as you avoid that big grave mistake, you won't have to live in this type of worse type of society. And this is where Terminator, right? It's warning you, hey, just as long as you are not so flippant with technology, that's what's going to destroy the world, right? And it's not that like the actual capitalist system that whether it's oil companies, whether it's the military industrial complex, that's what's actually, destroying our ability to survive on this planet, not AI, computers and stuff like that. And I think, yeah, like when it comes to the Hunger Games, a lot of stuff like that, it's like the framework of like, we still have the ability to solve the problem, which is not, something where sorry to bother you is
Yeah.
different, because by the end of it, you're realizing, no, we're actually in the pool right now. We're in the water right now.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry to Bother You was a story ostensibly from the capitalist perspective of a moving up of the social ladder. Because remember, he gets the call center job, and then he does his really good white sounding voice, and he gets a promotion, right? What happens when he gets his promotion is he has to decide, really make an ethical choice about whether he's going to have solidarity with his comrades in struggle to where he was from below. So he's moved up, and that's the beauty of why the film is actually a squarely anti-capitalist film at the end of the day, because there's no resolution there. There's no and that actually is nice, because what Boots Riley is saying back to us, that we need, that's why it's a class conscious film, is that we actually need to think about what the consequences are for ourselves between these seemingly micro gradient movements up the class system, that actually we're all intertwined with that, right? And there are like real conflicts that emerge by virtue of the place we. So it's all about trying to see class differently than we're trained to, right? And I think that, again, the fact that we only have a handful of Marxist-oriented film directors is a shame. We really need a lot more in Hollywood, even though Hollywood has a fundamental opposition to that framing of stories and narratives, I would argue.
I mean, do you think that's why, things like Squid Game and Parasite, someone coming literally outside of Hollywood, at least when, like, from his background as the director, is like just having a different perspective on socialism than someone growing up in the United States is going to allow a different story to be told.
Daniel, I'd like to challenge you on something you just said about that. We need more Marxist producers of film in Hollywood or directors. Isn't part of the problem that people are looking to popular culture to lead their revolution in the first place?
Yeah, that's true. I'm not saying we only need that. I mean, okay, we need a kind of, in my opinion, an organized working class party and develop kind of working class.
I'm not trying to. I don't want you to think I'm trying to chastise you.
No. But I would also say that public education on how we view social reality and so on, we would probably agree is deeply informed by popular culture, no doubt. So I'm not sure that there's big stakes there, I would say. Because the popular culture is going to be a reflection of the social antagonisms that we live with day to day. That reflection is often going to be quite distorted and even reactionary, like you said, with like Hunger Games. So like, it's most likely the case in a liberal capitalist society that its entertainment is going to have a kind of reactionary flavor to it. But most people are not going to internalize that as reactionary, right? So the more, I guess you could say, class conscious, we don't need to say Marxist. I feel like that's too academic. But like the more revolutionary oriented filmmakers that are doing high quality stuff, I think that's going to be quite positive. I don't mean to say that exclusive, that like we should be exclusively focusing on that. I guess I'm just trying to say it would be good.
Well, that's I think it's like part.
Super
All
chat.
right.
You got a super chat. Okay.
Super chat. This super chat is from MIDI Doctors. He says Hunger Games or Kingsman, etc., is about exceptionalism of individuals in the working class being accepted or replacing an institutional elite.
I think that's a really good observation. Actually, I think that's also another. I mean, I'm not an expert on film. There is a problem with film as a genre that, to make a film compelling, you usually have to have a protagonist, which generally ends up with this kind of Superman, like
Great man of history.
great man of history thesis. It's like a problem of the genre. But I do think like the messages, like especially something like Kingsman, which also has a deeply anti-political message at the end as well, because Hitler and Lenin are buddies at the end, and it's all just a big conspiracy against things. I do think there is that potential for those movies to be very much read as a kind of superhero style movie in which
well, I think that's true. I think that's true, but I also think that meritocracy as an ideology is breaking down. In other words, it's getting more and more difficult for people with a straight face to adhere to it. One, because it's evident that it's kind of a lie in a lot of ways. And I think two, it's evident that a lot of people abuse it as an ideology through the bootstrap mythology, which is frankly just offensive to most people, that you would even suggest that this is like an accurate depiction of how social mobility works in our society. So I feel like, of course, film and television is going to come from this ultra individualist thing. That's actually why films that portray collective liberation are so rare and so refreshing to watch, and probably a bit of a scandal to the Hollywood system.
Which films would you put in that category then, as a film that shows collective liberation?
I mean, very few, right? A very few. Snowpiercer was one example. Sorry to Bother You is another example.
Avatar is interesting. Anti-imperialist film, in my opinion. What was the example you used, Jenny, about the? Well, I hadn't seen it. You had recommended
The Expanse.
Yeah. Can you tell us about that program?
Yeah, I mean, like The Expanse was I don't know if people have seen it. It's a series of books, but there was a popular TV series about it. And what I find interesting about that is that it reflects the questions of globalization, because it's very much a story of class, but also on a difference between the core and the periphery, which is actually something I think is often missing in some of these portrayals. I guess Hunger Games to a certain extent has the core periphery thing, but it doesn't feel particularly deep, because you have, I mean, in the books of the Hunger Games, there are like some of the districts have a higher status than the others, some are more peripheral. But I think when you get to something like the Expanse, it speaks to issues of core versus periphery, with the outer solar system, the people being oppressed by Mars and Earth, which are the old powers, and the ideology that comes along with that is the people in the outer solar system are racialized to a certain degree, that they've become defective because they've been living out in the solar system. But what I find fascinating about the way that ends is that the ultimate solution to that problem in the TV series, not so much the books, is a compromise between the capitalist core and the capitalist periphery in order to share the wealth of the universe. So it's promotes a kind of, although you could read the books, and I don't want to spoil it, but like the very end of the books, you could actually read it as a socialism or barbarism story. But the TV show, in the way that it's put together, ends up with that kind of thing. And what's interesting about it is it's somewhere between the Superman of history version of TV, because there are kind of like, there's like a core group of characters who drive historical events, but at the same time there is a kind of deep discussion of movements that are represented, you know, in the show. And I think that there's a kind of tension, because I'm thinking of, like you said collective liberation.
Right.
There's the Snowpiercer.
You can also have collective liberation with an anti-hero, like Joker,
Right.
Todd Phillips' Joker.
Mm-hmm.
So he's an individual that starts a lumpen proletariat uprising from below of people that have been barred from social services, been discarded from the wage labor. And again, you know, there's a lot of communist thinking about what the era of 1970s till now. If you're a Marxist, you're always wanting to ask the question, what is the class within the proletariat that's going to be most primed for revolutionary potential? So if you take a thinker like Frantz Fanon, and you look at the way that Frantz Fanon was read by the Panthers, for example, the conclusion they drew was that it's actually not the traditional working class that's going to be the revolutionary potential, but it's going to be the sub-lumpen.
Right.
And Joker is actually a film about the activation of the lumpen proletariat, if you think about it. And that's why it's going to be so interesting to see part 2. Because now the lumpen proletariat has taken over, we assume, at the end. And Batman has to come in as a bourgeois hero versus the lumpen proletariat anti-hero. Right? So that's actually
the billionaire's literally like swooping in, you know. Like who's the villain again?
Batman is for the status quo, ultimately.
Right.
We don't really think about it that way, but that's actually his function.
He works with the cops.
He's a cop.
Yeah.
Batman's a cop. I mean, this is one of my main reasons why I'm not into like a lot of these Marvel. I was like, aren't 3/4 of these people cops? Aren't they like working with the cops? I was like, why are we like, you know, why are
Wakanda
superheroes?
Wakanda was working with the CIA.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think it's interesting how, you know, we have these different conceptions of class. I mean, definitely Panthers, you know, Fanon, you know, reading Fanon in a particular way, but also been influenced by Maoism, which seeks to find another revolutionary agent other than the proletariat in response to the liquidation of the early Chinese Communist Party in the 1920s. I think
the thing there is sort of they want to create in the struggle a unity between the working class and the lumpen or peasantry, even though we're kind of in a post-peasantry era, and that was actually not true in many other countries. But I think it's true, and you probably saw this with the Floyd uprising, that maybe we could say one dimension of the Floyd uprising that we need to pay more attention to is the lumpen dimension involved with the people who are most vulnerable to the police abuse and violence. If that makes sense, right? Because that brings us back and says sort of like, well, actually, Fanon's point still lives with us today. And we still need to work through that consequence.
Doesn't the outcome of the Floyd uprising show the limitations of that type of politics in the end, because it was ultimately driven into electing Joe Biden, whatever potentialities that was in looking for a mass politics outside of a strict independent class line. It leads to a reincorporation into capitalist politics, and we've seen this happen over and over again with history, where it's like where mass demands for emancipation end up reconstituting an existing social order, sometimes in a less oppressive way, but a lot of the time in a worse way. I just always think of the Arab Spring, and then the way that like mass demands for emancipation ended up being driven into even more repressive regimes in the best case, and in the worst case, into internecine and bloody civil wars.
Yeah, I want to hear what others think about this question about lumpen uprising, BLM, and Democratic Party capture. I have some thoughts on that, but I want to hear what others think about that. And everybody apparently is mad about the dog barking in the chat. Not my dog.
It was the dog. Yeah, it was Gene's dogs that were uprising.
Lumpen dogs.
Yes, which I think like there is, yeah, there's like the truth of sentiment, and you talk about the disparities with like black people and over police, it's like certainly like that history is there. And I think we've talked plenty about is like there's certain aspects of that time period, in our history that allowed for a mass movement to kind of like spontaneously erupt. You're looking at like the COVID lockdowns were happening in a lot of different places. People more just not working. And even the aspects of like there's a 9-minute video, like there's multiple viewpoints where they're showing like this cop murdered a guy. But like, what does that attach to? What is the movement's goals, and where does it go from there? Was it actually tackling over policing, or just over policing in black areas? Was it tackling the responses and all these things? Like, not really. It was kind of like the Black Lives Matter isn't focused on the structures of policing. It's focused on the police focus on black people, some of the systemic things, at its best, like its best interpretation. You could go on about the leadership and, the money and all those type of things, but that doesn't account for like literally millions of people still gathering. And then, that question is, what were the goals? What was the actual mechanism? Was it organization or mobilization? And then, what are the failures of those goals, which is not to actually show that the police are used, like Batman to withhold, just keep the status quo in check. In which case you could highlight the multiple other, wrongful police killings of white kids, and that happened too. But, without that actual class definition of it, of saying the cops brutalize poor people, black people more so to a higher rate, without having that actual full understanding and that organization and building towards that, tackling that issue, it was always kind of going to be where it's at now, where that one cop got arrested and he's guilty, and then here we are.
I separate the actual manifestations that we saw post-COVID during George Floyd from the foundation hatched petite bourgeoisie manifestation of hashtag Black Lives Matter, which I see as a ultimate reiteration of some of the worst elements of liberal bourgeois identity politics merging with the foundation world to create a captured politics in the name of race that is really about aggrandizing the economic situation of the leaders of that movement without even remotely being honest about the desire to create any kind of transformative politics for working class or poor black people, but really being about siphoning off wealth for those at the top. And I think it was really transparently a charade, and I was never a fan of it at all. I think that there were elements of the grassroots who worked within the Black Lives Matter paradigm who were interested in reforming police, but I think the leadership was ultimately corrupt at the top. And I think that was something that could have been seen by the way it developed in the first place as a hashtag trying to siphon off the energy of the Ferguson movement.
Well said.
Yeah. Amen to that. I mean, all right, it's been a big focus of Marxist study in the late 20th century about the masses in revolt, even going back to Maoism, because Maoism's whole point, which is pretty interesting for us to retain for our present day, which is that you have a proletarian workers' party with kind of trained intellectuals part of it, so on. But then you also have an unruly masses that face day-to-day exploitation and oppression, and they revolt. They revolt against the system. You don't know when they revolt, but they do. You can plan it. You can expect it. And I think today we can also expect revolt in our future, obviously. What worries me is that revolt ends up being a kind of feral revolt that, as Pascal said, is very vulnerable to elite capture, very vulnerable to NGO, DNC capture. So that's a knowledge we have. That's a memory we have to keep there and ask, what are the consequences of that? If we can expect revolt and we can expect revolt to get captured, let's keep both things in mind.
Can we expect revolt or can we expect rebellion?
Yeah.
I mean, for me, that's mincing. That's the same. What's that distinction for you?
Well, in other words, are we talking about organized, sentient people who are trying to mobilize a mass politics to challenge the status quo? Or are we talking about people who are just reacting to a political phenomenon and making noise?
January 6th versus, an actual,
or even organized Black Lives Matter protests versus spontaneous Black. I think that's an interesting question. I think because even if a protest or rebellion is organized to a certain degree, if it does not have a kind of clear objective, what is going to happen to it? If your objective is very vague, even with all the best of intentions, you leave yourself open. I think one of the important things we talk about is that has to be talked about is just the way that the Democratic Party has captured mass politics to such a degree. The Republicans are doing it a bit now, I guess. They've got their MAGA stuff, they've got their COVID lockdown things, but the Democratic Party is so good at just diverting any anti-systemic rebellion into becoming, and I hate to say it, becoming their shock troopers, right? If you for example, of course it was not the intention of anti-fascist people in Portland to be the shock troops of the Democratic Party. Clearly that is not what they want to be. The notion that people want to martyr themselves for Joe Biden's election is ridiculous. But if you buy so much in to the notion that the struggle, as Jody Dean points out, is between liberal democracy and fascism, then if your politics is driven by that, you are de facto acting in the interest of the Democratic Party, because you're saying one party of capital is so much more dangerous than the other that we have to ally ourselves with the Democratic Party to fend off. And that's kind of a lesser of two evils, which has been the Stalinist approach since the 1930s, which I don't know how, I have no idea how you overcome this, because there are conditions where the Republicans may be more dangerous. But the problem with anti-Trump, anti-fascism is not that the Republicans are not dangerous to liberal democracy, but perhaps in certain cases, the Democratic Party, for different reasons, can be quite dangerous. I don't know how you overcome that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the Democrats are house is burning. The Democrats are the firefighters that come, and you think, oh, thank God. But they hand you a cup of water and say good luck. I think that's where in a movement that's going to stick and actually be effective is going to have to show that, that they're both, equally, or not equal, I get want to fucking say, but they're both in the same camp. They're both for the system that is creating these conditions, and I think that's what's difficult, right? Is that there's nothing, saying, Black Lives Matter and trying to have some police reforms doesn't, square that framework. It allows the Democratic Party to keep doing it.
You got two dimensions at work. You have rebellions, which are usually driven by an unjust killing of a Black person or other such egregious moments, which can or cannot get captured. Usually it takes some time. Ferguson, Michael Brown took a while to get captured, if you look at it, actually. And it was kind of, let's call it authentic for a while, a local rebellion. The movement of the squares was interesting because it couldn't get captured in a way. Why? Because at its core, it did have a fundamentally anti-capitalist position. And it was kind of imitated in Turkey and Egypt and New York and London and you name it. And people lived in these camps and they kind of got together in person, not online, and tried to talk about revisioning capitalism. And it had some wherewithal, it had some staying power. It dissolved in tragic ways, of course, but maybe part of it goes back to two dimensions. One is the ambition of your demands and their relationship to capitalism. And two, a party that's not the Democrats, at least in America, that if you have a party that's a workers' party that is going to infuse itself with the rebellion, that's going to look very different than the left wing of Capital Party. We don't know what that looks like. Maybe one day we will.
Which I don't. And then this can't even go into like.
Can I suggest a change to your metaphor? The Democrats aren't the firefighters who come to give you a cup of water. The Republicans come and burn your house down, but the Democrats are the people who sold you the flammable facade for your building in the first place.
Yeah, and that's where though it's like I think we have an understanding too of like, and I don't know, this is probably just maybe like an online thing, I think like organizers in real life like understand this aspect, but it doesn't get translated to like a lot of the discussion is that Republicans and Democrats, i.e. like the voting blocks, aren't the only people in the United States, and like we have earlier the discussion of like the lumpen proletariat, like there is, millions of people who are completely disengaged from electoral politics 100%. What is the political apparatus for them? What's the political apparatus organizing their political power that they inherently have? And that's where I think there's a lot of faulty, kind of the discussions of like, oh, do we go after, this group that follows this already, politician or this saying or whatever the hell, and ignore the fact that there's a lot of people who are completely disengaged from a lot of these conversations that are living in these scenarios that are being portrayed in a lot of the like, films and stuff like that, yet they're not in that organization that eventually pushes back against, the elites. And I think that's kind of like, well, where do we go from here? And it like kind of falls back to the same shit of like, well, we need to organize the people and have that, have that discussion of like, who are the people we're talking about? This is going to look different with different communities, different geographies and shit like that. But, at the end of the day, it's that same thing of, and like, it's difficult, I guess, too, of like, what's actually going to stick. Because what sticks is not going to be what's popular, right? When they say the revolution is not going to be televised, whatever's working to fight back against capital is not going to be blasted, in TV and film and all that type of shit.
Yeah, and the right now is an insurrectionary right after Jan 6, and there's evidence maybe that the future is going to show some kind of more I don't know, like energy, insurrectionary energy coming from the right if the elite liberal institutions can quell popular rebellion. That's a prospect that I think we need to be concerned with and look at.
No, there's definitely a concern about the fact that the energy of rebellion is on the right.
Right.
That's a fact.
Right.
And Jouissance?
I have a slight pivot for us. We have another super chat from Secret Asian Dan. Is there a more Marxist/socialist alternative form of narrative that can replace the hero's journey?
Good question.
Good question.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel, you are our expert.
There's not one. I think that a lot of Marxists do want to say that there is no overcoming of, it's not anti-individualism in a narrow sense, but it's like, what would the utopian imagination? I think that it comes down to what version of utopia are we going to experiment with. This is why I was really interested in the author that wrote The Ministry of the Future.
Kim Stanley Robinson.
Yeah. He's a good example of a non-individualist vision of a society to come. So, but again, he's trained by Frederick Jameson, the academic Marxist at Duke University, which
well, he wrote I mean, I think his Kim Stanley Robinson's greatest work is his Mars trilogy, which really is, it has characters, but it really is a story about the masses in history, which I think. But the question comes down to this: like, is that a filmable thing? Like, there's a lot you can do with the literary. There's a lot you can do with literary genre, but like film is a different kettle of fish. For example, they recently attempted to adapt the Foundation series of books, right? In Apple TV. And the problem with that was that in order to adapt them to the screen, it had to be transformed from a kind of historical epic where the characters are secondary into a story which people find compelling with leading characters, and and a protagonist who is like at the pivot of every single historical event in the universe. So like my feeling is, to a certain degree, at least in the current conventions of what makes it I think you'd have to go way off the track of what is seen as conventionally plausible in making a TV series. You'd have to have and studios are conservative. That's why they make endless Marvel movies now and reboots, because they not only are they conservative, they're becoming more conservative in terms of the kind of films that they're going to green light. So having something that radically departs from like what is a traditional narrative is is difficult to do. And I think, for example, one of the reasons I think the early seasons of Game of Thrones were popular, for example, is not that they totally departed from that traditional script, but because they were moving away from the paradigm of a psychodrama, someone's at the center of the universe, to more of a story about how people in kind of chained into actions, not by their will or their agency, but by their like social position in society. Of course, it's like a medieval feudal fantasy, but I think why it went off the deep end and nobody liked the last seasons is because they moved to that more conventional paradigm, right? because that's what Hollywood is safe with. So if you wanted to depart from a traditional method of making a film, albeit not like a book you can do anything in, you're going to have a difficult time, because who's going to fund a high risk project that, and someone mentioned it in the chat, that's going to end up like Cloud Atlas, which has a very unconventional narrative structure, and people didn't like. I don't know.
Yeah, I think when you talk about the portrayal of Hollywood activism, or like shows that would be dealing with political themes, 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10, those portrayals are going to be reaffirming the individual against the herd or against the masses. This is like a huge motif that comes back, stretching back to the 19th century. The individual against the dullard masses is a big thing of kind of bourgeois novels, literature, film, etc. And I think maybe Marxist films would have to reverse that and show the heroism of the masses, and in so doing, maybe present a different idea of what individualism is actually all about at the end of the day. And I think that's something that maybe the new generation will be forced to do, as we see more popular revolts, as we see more political antagonisms which cannot be solved by raising consciousness and NGO activism and the kind of standard ways we're told to approach political problems, like climate change, for example. And it's like no surprise that the narrative always has to also select, this is not so much in film, but we always have to find that one young person who goes against the herd and starts something on their own initiative. It's always through a kind of individualist, entrepreneurial, heroic narrative, right? It's why I was always interested in how Hart and Negri, these really famous communist authors, tried to synthesize the failures of 20th century Marxism in their trilogy of books called Empire series. And by the end of their Empire series, they had chapters on why Marxists and socialists need to resurrect a new idea of the entrepreneur. And I was always thinking to myself, like, wait a second, is that true? Is that what we need to do? I'm not sure. What would
Do you
that
think?
look
But and I think it's, you raise a really interesting point about the individual going against the herd. If we look in traditional narratives, often the story of someone being swept up by a movement and the masses is portrayed negatively, right? It's not an experience of liberation, but it's an experience of enslavement, because of course
you only escape irrationality by affirming individualism. It's like the masses don't possess a reason. They don't possess egalitarian potential or an emancipatory potential, right? You have to divide yourself against them, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that is, that is like, when you think about it, this is like the whole paradigm of liberal politics, right? This is what you see, like people, there's this New York race for a local position in the local Senate, and you have a progressive host, and then you have the DSA candidates conflicting with each other. Everybody in that discussion focuses on the drama, like, oh, like she said this, oh no, she didn't. That's not the most interesting part of that conflict. The interesting part of that conflict is because it represents two different understandings of politics and of emancipation. One is you have a movement, and the movement puts people into power to run for office, right? It's the party picks. Whether you agree with DSA or not, that's like irrelevant. The other is a liberal, bourgeois, reformist, progressive paradigm of politics where institutions are bad, right? Like per se, DSA is bad, right? The FBI is bad. They're all bad. The solution to politics is a good individual with good politics who is going to be the hero, right?
Yeah.
And
this is why a really good definition of what Marxists used to call bourgeois ideology, which nobody really says anymore. But one kind of easy definition of it is that it's a form of thinking about politics in which there's no stakes of your commitment to the consequences of your positions that you hold. And as an example, I was struck by the way that a lot of elite liberals on social media, like Stephen King, the famous author, when he learned about his support for the Ukraine thing involved fascists, and he was spending like months, supporting it, on a dime with no consequences he could rescind. That's bourgeois ideology. And I think that socialist and Marxist ideology is harder, because the power, the ruling class holds us accountable, but we also have to hold ourselves accountable for the ideological positions that we hold. So we can't let ourselves off so easily. You know what I mean? And I think that's just humbling fact of what it means to actually be like a class conscious person,
Is the idea of this entrepreneur that you're talking about, does that lead us back to the conscious capitalism? It's the person with the business that's going to be good.
I don't think so. And and this is where
it doesn't have to.
Because like I think that there's examples, like right now, in like Petro, who just got inaugurated
Colombia.
in Colombia. Yeah, he was. I mean, he's talking about the entrepreneurial spirit.
Right.
And like that's the thing is like there exists, you know, I guess a relationship to work and to being like leader of like or like the head or like the top manager or whatever of some type of like local, you know, co-op or whatever the hell, you know, and that can tie into like in an entrepreneurial spirit. You know, it's more about like, do you want to start and foster an organization within your community that is functional and helpful to the
Right.
community? But we think of it as, hey, am I going to start, you know, am I going to do a tech startup about, you know, a lawn mowing app, in which case I take all the local teenagers, you know, give them $5 an hour to mow the lawns while I'm charging $10 an hour to use the app. You know, like that's what we
In other
see
words,
in the United States, but it
we
doesn't
can
have to
flip the
exist.
definition of entrepreneurialism to include and to mean something that is about mobilizing individual skill sets to collective goals, as opposed to simply mobilizing it to making profit.
True. Good business plan too, Marcus. Just want to
I
say
mean,
that.
and this is like this is the old Leninist position anyway. You know, the point, you know, that Lenin makes at the end of the day is that the working class, in and of itself, can get to a certain level of consciousness, but there needs to be a revolutionary agent from outside of professional revolutionaries that can.
The vanguard. Jim's
Hold,
been reading some
hold on.
Lenin. Oh boy, here we go.
Hold on with that though. Wait a second though. I actually am of the opinion that we need to revisit what Lenin meant by the vanguard. Because two things. First of all, Lenin took very seriously what Pascal called the class of the petty bourgeoisie.
Mhm.
Kind of what Eric Olin Wright would call the contradictory class. They're kind of in between the two primary classes. Lenin said in his reading of Marx that they cannot be at the forefront of liberation of the proletariat, that the working class needs to be. But you need to have a bit of opportunism when working with them in careful ways to ensure their solidarity with the working class, which is a major challenge in our country, which we need to think hard about. We need to think hard about that. As it pertains to vanguard, Lenin said that the vanguard is not a static, educated Uber class that kind of comes in from above.
No,
said,
it's created.
It's created
It's created
by a dialectical exchange with the working class. The working class decides the vanguard. Whether those people come from a working class background or not is neither here nor there.
Yeah,
It's about the active interaction of the working class to, let's say, a potential vanguard. But
I think that's important to make. I mean, Lenin, you know, makes the point to distinguish. You know, it doesn't matter if the origins of the professional revolutionary is working class or not. The party should be the vehicle through which they can engage in politics. I think of course, I think Leninism can be debased into a sense where it's like, oh well, the you know, like the intellectuals have to lead because they're the only one with the appropriate consciousness. No, I don't think.
Well, no, I mean, it does have a bad history, though, especially in America, of the intellectuals interacting with the working class. It doesn't always go well. And there's a whole blind spot when thinking about the vanguard theory. There's a whole blind spot that we have because it has not always worked out how it should.
And the other point that you make, I think, is important, is about like, well, even in Marx's work, when he talks about working men, he's not like talking exactly all the time about the same thing as he means when he says proletariat in a kind of scientific sense. There is a notion of building some kind of alliance that encompasses various sectoral elements of the working class that are differentiated, as well as elements who are alienated by capitalism. I mean, that's the key.
Like for example, there's an interesting study of some communist activity in the early 80s, just as neoliberalism was really getting off the ground, that was working with immigrants. And part of the way that they strategically made an alliance with the petty bourgeoisie is that they use things like compassion and asked landlords to ease up on requiring payments. So there's that kind of solidarity that does have to take place, and you can't pretend that small business owners and petty bourgeois people are somehow to be liquidated or something like that, or to be discarded or ignored, or whatever have you. We need to figure out how to work with them, right? But again, I think Lenin would want to say work with them with the centering of working class interests first. So how do you convince them of that? Is probably something we talk about in a future episode, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that like there is, I don't know, maybe not landlords, but and also, and like even like going back to like talking about like entrepreneurial spirit, and like Zapatistas selling coffee, which
Right.
is like funny because like Alex Jones is like one of the biggest salesmen for Zapatista
Not that
coffee.
again.
But that that's I think like probably like the best aspect of it. But like as you're describing as well, is like if you are actually out in your community organizing, like there are people within your communities that like own businesses that are going to be helpful. They're going to be willing. They're going to be able to be organized. They're going to be able to leverage their business, in order to help. And that's like this happens a lot, right? Like we talk about charity and donations and all this shit not being enough to help. But if you're an organization and that shit sitting there on the shelf, like take it, use it to be helpful. And then possibly have discussions with that person who's, creating, making, and with that business to say, hey, there's a way that you can actually help more, right? And you could actually be a part of restructuring. So you no longer have to give out these little things, right? And we can just reach, but that's a long process from A to B. And it starts with just like creating that relationship, and using sympathy, asking for help. Hey, your kids are hungry. Do you got some extra donuts? And like go from there, because that's already what a lot of the organizations do. Our problem with it is that it's not enough, but those actions can be still built upon. That doesn't have to all be burned down.
Yeah, I feel like mutual aid without a clear sense of your core objectives and the interests you're trying to further, which have to think along class lines, as I've tried to say, isn't gonna produce the goods, So it's
I'm just trying. I think we had a super chat.
Yes, we do have a super chat with a very, very important message from Cameron Robson. He says, you'd be surprised how many people love the crack. He's trying to fill in for the soundboard.
He is trying to fill in. Well, we appreciate super chat soundboards here at This Is Revolution. It helps Jason get even more soundboard drops on his soundboard thingy, which is what we all need. Pascal, how do you feel about the soundboard?
I like the soundboard. The soundboard is fine, but listen, I think that we should actually thank Daniel for his coming out on the show and really filling us with this very deep conversation about left theory, Marxist theory, Leninism, film critique. This has been a very, very rich conversation. It's been very, very deep, and we don't want to waste this time talking about the soundboard.
Well, I have a question.
Okay.
So to Marcus's earlier point about you have these movies where I guess it starts after our time, but before the time the movie starts, where something has happened. And I wonder if you think that that's a sort of a reflection of dealing with climate change.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's like a whole other thing we could do, is sort of films about the end of the world, because there's that whole debate, and this goes to the heart of the kind of inadequacy of the liberal imagination of that most creative people just intuitively inhabit, because by virtue of their middle class background, by virtue of the educational situation we have in this country, what can we imagine beyond catastrophism? And and beyond the nihilism involved with this doom feeling and so on, which that's an interesting question. I think the climate change piece cannot be reduced to just a kind of empty catastrophism. There has to be art that centers something more radically humanistic, right? Like, which is why I felt like when we speak about these things of revolutionary Marxism, in my opinion, we should be comfortable to say that we are also trying to think about human existence on this planet as well. We are revolutionary humanist Marxists. I'm happy to say that. Fanon said he was a humanist Marxist in a radical way, right? So we want to be real about the social antagonisms that exist in our present and how to transform them in a revolutionary way. If it's going to be some passive climate catastrophe without our agency, we need to insist on what our agency looks like to change the situation before it's too late. Before it's too late. So now we have a kind of liberal, I don't know, anti-humanist pessimism that's there. I feel like radical voices need to offer a humanistic, optimistic vision of what can happen.
Well, I think that can also be problematic because
What do you mean?
The Anthropocene is kind of what got us here, focusing on humans.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
at some point, we're going to need to put human beings back on the spectrum with life, bio.
Right. Yeah,
And
that's
something
fair.
we seem to refuse to do, no matter what the politics are.
Yeah, you're right. It's tricky to say. Yeah, you're right.
It is.
I accept that. But look, it's been an honor to just be with you all, and thanks for the chats. And let's do it again.
Yeah.
Yeah, I kind of even feel I feel bad too because like we didn't even get to bring up Succession, you know. Which, like,
That's such a neo-feudal deal, isn't it? Though,
That's-
in a way, it is. What I like about Succession, I'll say one thing. Did you ever notice that, speaking of class, that the thinking of the patriarchal guy, whoever the leader of the family, did you ever notice when he talks about social unrest and the masses, that he's always doing it with class analysis? It's like at the top they think class, you know.
They know. Yes, they know.
They know the stakes, right? They know the stakes, and in that sense, maybe it was kind of an honest portrayal, in some sense, because the masses, we're not allowed to think class, but the 1% does. So,
I'm glad that we have the topic that we're going to discuss the next time you come back already set. We're going to talk about Armageddon and the Jetsons.
There we go.
Yeah.
Well, guys, it has been a total pleasure. And, Daniel, I hope you can come back again at some point and we can talk more, especially when Jason is here, because I know Jason was really looking forward to talking with you because he's very much into this discussion of pop culture and how class and things like that are portrayed. So, any final words, Pascal, before?
No, it was a great show. It was a great conversation. It was a very important conversation on a very great variety of subjects.
Let people know where we can find you, Daniel.
First and last name on Twitter. I offer this thing during the pandemic. It's basically free seminars with like Marxist thinkers, and I also psychoanalysis is a big field for me. So if you check out torsion groups or study groups on psychoanalysis and politics, we got a big conference at the end of the month on Slavoj Žižek's work, with like big Žižek scholars coming on to talk about his work, and Žižek himself will be there as well. And it's going to be live on YouTube. I interview a bunch of as an interview. I also have an interview program through Zero Books, which is the publication that Mark Fisher founded. And I'm writing a book right now on the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and contemporary socialism, because we kind of touched on this theme of like ultra individualism And I find Nietzsche's philosophy some of the most successful reactionary ultra-individualism, which paradoxically the left has adopted. And I want to raise that as a question as to whether it's a good thing to adopt that philosophy or not. I think it's not.
Yeah.
There
Well,
we go.
that's things like Jordan Peterson talks a lot about Nietzsche.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
Awesome. Excited for that.
Yeah.
I think you got a lot
So
of
does the
faith.
left, though, too. So does the left.
Yeah.
Everybody talks about him, but maybe that's
That's a discussion for another day. There we go.
Mhm.
Well, once again, thank you. It's been good. And remember, chat, you can like, subscribe if you'd like. You really help us in the algorithm. I should probably plug the merch, just in case you want some merch. Look at us being good entrepreneurs. You can get the This Is Revolution Cup, the This Is Revolution Central Committee. You can get a cup. There's all kinds of stuff. Anglo-pessimism, all the good stuff. It really helps us out. Don't worry. We're not funding Jason's jet set lifestyle. We're bringing more and more exciting shows to the field. And with that, Pascal, do you want to say it?
We are out.